the second lecture. The first one was on purpose, and it's online, and we'll start from here. So, let's see. So last week we talked about purpose. What is purpose? To have people follow you, you need to inspire them. Leadership comes from expressing a purpose to people. We talked about starting with why. Most companies, most organizations tell you what they do. They tell you how they're different, and they usually don't know why they do anything. But if you make a lot of money and you're a big company, and you have customers, not knowing why you do it is okay. And the challenge for each one of you is when you think about long range, about what you're going to be doing and why you're doing it, you need to think about scaling and extending. So we'll not talk about that. We talked about that last week. And what we'll talk about today is this line, this curve. So once you know why you're doing what you're doing, why is the purpose, if you want to achieve significant impact in a short time, there is nothing in the universe that just goes like this. Nothing in the universe of man-made things. So you need to follow some kind of a curve that will be exponential. And that is a key thing. And I've met so many startups in my life that want to go in a slow-moving, stable market because it's big. So, you know, there are a billion Chinese, or there were. It's a really great idea to sell pencils, to make pencils for Chinese. Because if each Chinaman and woman buys a pencil, it's a huge market. But for reasons that I'll talk about, that's doomed to failure. So, a few anecdotes here. I started up a company together with a professor at the Weizmann Institute in 1993, 25 years ago. And the reason I joined him is not because of the application. The application was actually not that interesting, but in '93, he thought about doing co-editing of documents on the internet through email. If you think, then it was really novel because attachments, what's called MIME, started in 1993 about. I mean, you could not attach anything to email at that time. But what really made me join him, and we started a company called Ubique, was he showed me a graph that looked like this. And the graph was the number of unique internet addresses, IP addresses. Internet started in '68, and in 1991, the Gore bill, named after Al Gore, Senator Gore, opened the internet to everybody. And when I met him in 1993, there were 2.5 million IP addresses. And so it's amazing, right? It's a huge number. Today, if you look at the same graph, you don't even see 1993. I mean, things were like that. It doesn't register. You don't see it. So how did we end up with only 15 million users? So we had failure of imagination, mostly, and failure of execution. So one thing is we couldn't imagine that in 25 years, 2.5 million addresses are probably heading towards 50 billion. You know, Internet of Things, everything has an IP address today. It's a huge number. We just couldn't imagine that this wave will go so big. And the second thing, we didn't scale, which is what I really want to point out here. So eventually, we dropped the idea of a joint editing of documents, and Udi, the professor, gave me a book called Neuromancer. It's a science fiction book. He said, I want to create this cyberspace. This is a great thing. Let's do cyberspace. And what was usual in those days was an architecture that's called client-server, for those of you who remember. So you have a server somewhere on the internet, and you have a piece of software, a client, that can access this server. So that was the architecture, and the engineers who were researchers at the university were really proud that they could have multiple users, and asked how many, and they said 32. So 32 is a very suspect number. I asked, why 32? I said, well, it has to do with the file ID or something like that. I said, it's too small, you got to think bigger. So next week they came back really proud, 64. 64, some kind of a trick with the hashing or, I don't know, error correction or something that enabled them to do 64. They told me, you can't do it, it's not economic. You have to think of thousands or tens of thousands of people. Impossible. Within less than 2 years, a company by the name of AOL acquired us. Why did they acquire us? They were in panic. Naturally, that relates to what I'll talk about. They just grabbed any company that would allow them to buy them. And we were one of the very few companies in the world. So, the vacuum cleaner took us up too. And they decided to make a game, an online game, a multi-user game called The Witches. So you can guess how many people could play the game at one time, right? 64. And there was a lot of multimedia. In those days, games did all kinds of multimedia, right? So you actually, to play the game on the internet, you needed a DVD that had all the images. So they hired a company in South Tel Aviv. There were many companies in South Tel Aviv, Chovan Sger in that area, that did multimedia. Most of it was shockwave and all kinds of technologies that are not used today. And there were three guys in that company that said, this architecture is really stupid because they pass everything. I was no longer there, by the way. I left to make another startup. They're actually taking all the content and moving it through the server and keeping it there. You don't need that. People could actually, all we need is to have a kind of a switchboard, and people can, there is an internet for moving things between people. You don't need to have it on the server. Of course, that became peer-to-peer. And that was the beginning of ICQ. So we were the inspiration for ICQ. The company was then acquired by IBM, and this is part of IBM Domino, same time, and there are 15 million users, but we really failed to think about scale. So lesson number one, as a startup, you want to ride an external wave that is really going exponential, and then you need to not just do it because you can raise money, but you need to think about scale, because if it's really going to go like this, and you cannot scale, then you're not going to be able to succeed. So I'll give a few other examples. This topic started a lot of research and thinking in academia, and there are all these how-to-do business books. There was something called Crossing the Chasm 25, 28 years ago. And there is a lecture called Start with Why. And there's a guy who makes a lot of money on drawing 3 circles on board, preaching to corporates. And this thing, which is 3 lines, comes from Professor Christensen in Harvard Business School. So he claims, and there are 2 books which I would recommend to read, and if I remember, I'll put them on the website. I'll put the links. He says there are really 2 types of innovation. One is sustaining innovation, and one is disruptive innovation. So I'll explain this graph. Over time, there is, technology improves in performance. It's faster, more accurate, however you measure performance. And what's limiting the angle of this increase in performance are 2 things. One, research and development of technology, and the other one is the ability of customers to absorb. I mean, you cannot throw your smartphone every day and adopt a new one. We have limited capacity to adopt things. And companies, sustaining innovation is what companies that have customers do. So the best customers, the customers that yield, the best profit margins, are the most demanding customers. And you want to give them, the best technology. So Intel's top processor has, I don't know how many cores, and how many gigahertz, and how many gigabytes. Not everybody needs that. In fact, for the average customer using microprocessors, Intel's top line is an overkill. It's too good. Okay? And that means that as you go down the needs of customers, there is always a segment that is unserved or underserved. And that is where a startup should go. Because you cannot compete with Intel, with the best processor in the world. It just takes too much time, too much money, really, really difficult to do. So you want to go to customers who are unserved or underserved and give them technology that's good enough. And now you have customers, because startups don't have customers. And you improve the technology, and you ride this curve. And actually, it doesn't look like that. It's not a straight line, but never mind that. And at some point, actually the curve looks more like this. And at some point, you cut this company. At some point, your technology is better than good enough. And now you have a lot of customers, and now you're in the same place. Now you start doing sustaining innovation. And the key message from this is that disruptive technology is here. You start with a market that's not served well enough. So maybe I'll give an example from the domain I know pretty well, which is the transportation or automotive domain. So if you are a BMW and you want to sell cars to people living in New York, you will probably sell to people living on the Upper East Side, Upper West Side, I don't know, whatever side of New York. People have a lot of money near Central Park, and you have the top line of your car. It's really, really expensive. That's where you have Tesla owners and so on. But there are many people in New York City who are underserved, right? So if you're on 10th Street, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and you want to go uptown, there are no taxis. There aren't enough taxis in New York. So a company by the name of Uber, which has no customer, comes and we can do something very simple. There are enough people who have cars and they have no income, and we'll make this app, which does almost nothing. It just connects rider to driver. And all of a sudden, in a very, very short time, in addition to 13,500 taxi drivers in New York, which have been there always, like for 80 years, it's the same number, there are 60,000 Uber and Lyft drivers. And Uber apparently is going to go public this year, and it's probably going to be the biggest IPO, initial public offering of any company. They're probably going to go public at a valuation of more than $100 billion. Okay, why? Because they can grow like this. But they don't even make cars, and they don't give the best experience, but they give much more than what people had, because what people had was riding yellow cabs, if they can find one, or walking, or taking the subway. And, yeah.
How come there are many more competitors? There's no network effect.
For Uber.
Uber.
So that's a great question. Doesn't have anything to do with that, but Uber is, if you think about what Uber is doing, there is no competitive barrier, right? It's really trivial to do that. The barrier that Uber is setting to competitors is that they know how to raise huge amounts of capital and lose huge amounts of capital.
Yeah,
that's
they're not the only one in the world who can raise money.
Yeah, but in the US, the only other company that managed to squeak in and raise a couple of $1 billion is Lyft. So in the US, nobody else can raise that much money, and they froze the market. Nobody else is even trying to do anything, because if you can't raise, $5–10 billion, you can't lose $5–10 billion. You cannot acquire customers. They're losing money on every customer. But a company named Didi could do that in China, and they actually pushed Uber out of China. A company called Ola is still fighting with Uber in India. A company called Grab is doing it in Southeast Asia. So it's a kind of a local thing. Uber discovered that they cannot extend to other countries as easily. But in America, there's really low barrier to competition, and as long as Uber can go and raise another $10 billion, nobody can compete. And WeWork used to be like that, maybe still is like that. And there are several companies like that. But that's a kind of abnormal thing, right? Don't take an example from Uber.
What's
It's
the
not a good
nature?
example.
How come they can raise money if they are losing money on each customer?
It has to do with the original founder of Uber. Very aggressive, and he was kicked out. And if you and I were starting a company like that, we'd probably go to the Ministry of Transportation and to the cities, and we'd try to be nice people and figure out, what are the regulations. And Uber doesn't care.
So maybe this is the barrier.
Uber has tens of thousands of lawsuits against the company for breaking the rules, and they don't care. And they're never going to go to jail. What they care? They raise another few $1 billion.
So maybe this is the barrier, not the money.
The barrier is, well, that's originally. Now they're trying to be nice.
Yeah, but now if you're looking at
Now
their
it's an open game
PLC,
already.
if you look at their line of PLC, which is not equivalent to the line that you prior showed, which is very, very high,
Very
high
steep.
curve.
Yeah.
The PLC, the product life cycle, they are already in the aging.
Yeah, but we don't know about Uber. Uber may disappear, very, very fast, because I don't think they have a viable business. But let's forget about Uber for a moment and talk about, real companies that we know. So I'll give a few more examples of that. And I just want to say one more thing about the word disruptive. In Hebrew, there is no good word. So disruptive is translated into shibush. And it's a terrible word, because shibush, you think of something kind of, somebody walks and you stick your foot there.
It's had the bad connotation.
Disruptive is breaking.
Okay.
But disruptive is something that is really kind of aggressive. The real disruption is not one product replacing another product. That's not a
So
disruption.
we like Casa.
Casa, yes, that's a great thing. I agree. I think the real disruption is when a startup is working outside of the value network or the ecosystem of the incumbents, the companies that are the rulers today, and they create a new value network. That's when real high value enterprises form. That is when you come in and you totally ignore a big value network. And if you think, for example, we'll show a few examples here. So I'll show a few examples. But this is, I think this is right. I think what Christensen is saying is right. He has very nice lectures. They're very long. He's a really, really nice guy. And really smart and expresses himself in a very simple way. So let's look at some other examples. Well, this works. Let's see this short video here.
The book explains how successful companies that dominate their industries fail in the face of disruptive innovation. It's a message of caution for leadership teams at these companies, but also a message of encouragement for competitors venturing against these Goliaths. First, we'll distinguish between sustaining and disruptive innovation. Then, we'll discuss why it's difficult for most companies to adopt disruptive technologies. And finally, what does it all mean for both large companies and startups? There are two types of innovation, sustaining and disruptive. A company follows a path of sustaining innovation when it improves a product's performance based on feedback from its best and largest customers. It's usually about reducing defects and making something faster or more powerful. In contrast, a disruptive innovation often involves lower performance in many of the key features valued by the market. It often means more defects and less speed or power. A disruptive product appears as if it's doing everything wrong. A large company with sophisticated and demanding clients can't adopt such a technology. Why would anyone want to focus on a disruptive innovation? The subtle but key difference is that sustaining innovation satisfies customers' current needs, whereas disruptive technologies and business models evolve to meet customers' future needs. These two types of innovation are at the core of the innovator's dilemma. Following a sustaining innovation path makes a lot more sense in the short term, but can ultimately doom the company to failure. On the other hand, dedicating valuable resources to a niche and unproven opportunity doesn't make sense, but can be the future of the company. Disruptive innovation is often born from a need that exists in a niche market that's neglected by current market offerings. That small market segment may not care about traditional performance features. A great example is cameras and smartphones. Smartphones started with very poor camera capabilities that served only the lowest tier of customers. Initially, they were pretty useless as cameras, and few people would use them. But they evolved in leaps and bounds, and now have successfully displaced cameras for many traditional uses. Similar business model and technological disruptions appear all over the place. Wikipedia rendered encyclopedias extinct. Google Maps replaced expensive navigation systems. Skype dealt a big blow to big companies. Netflix drove large video rental retail chains to bankruptcy. The Kindle is changing book publishing. Airbnb is driving hotel managers crazy. And Uber has taxi drivers up in arms. The question is, why are large, well-resourced companies often caught asleep? Why aren't they at the forefront of disruptive innovation? Given the small market size and unappealing characteristics of a disruptive technology, a successful company can't dedicate resources to small and unproven offerings. What does this mean for large companies' future? Even though disruptive innovations may not make sense in the short term, they simply can't be ignored. Companies need to listen to their customers in order to continue successfully with their sustaining innovations. But they need to look at niche markets and how they use their products in order to identify potentially disruptive innovations and embrace them. For startups, it's all good news. As long as their innovation has the potential to improve performance rapidly, it's actually a good thing that their initial market is small. This gives them more time to fine-tune their technology. Many startups have been and will continue to be surprised by their much larger competitors' indifference. The Innovator's Dilemma was published in 1997, but continues to be an extremely insightful.
Okay. You can buy the book, you don't need to buy the book. I'll give you a few examples, but the biggest lesson here is don't go into a big market where there are many big companies, incumbents, that dominate the market. That is almost certainly death. Okay, you're just going to die there. These companies are slow. That's the first message. The second message is don't be afraid of these companies because they're impotent. Large companies should not scare you. Just don't try to sell to their customers. Sell to a niche that they don't occupy because it's not worthwhile for them. So I'll give you a few examples. One from my own experience in the 1990s, I worked in a company called Cadence in San Jose. It was already public. Cadence is an engineering solution for engineers who develop integrated circuits, chips, microchips, and electronic systems, and so on. And we were the top of the heap. There were 3 companies, they shared the market, and we were doing very well. All our products are running on Sun microsystem and very powerful workstations. And I noticed that something was happening on the low end where we don't really have customers. So if you want to do prototyping of a chip, you don't go and, developing a chip from the ground up and manufacturing it, you need investments of tens of millions of dollars. It's really, really expensive. So there are companies that have products, chips that are called FPGAs, Field Programmable Gate Array. And what you can do with these, they're very, very expensive, but if you buy in quantities of 1 or 2 or even 100 or 1,000, it's a very good way to get into the market, and the chips are good, are big. They are not as fast as doing your own chip from the ground up, a full custom semiconductor device, but they're a lot faster than using a microprocessor. So these companies were coming up, and there were many more. These are the 3 that survived. There were probably 10, 15, something like that. And I saw them as threats for us because each one of them had its own design tool. And we were not selling microprocessors or chips, we were selling tools to Intel and to those companies. But all of a sudden, these companies appear and they go to very low-end customers with their own design tools. And I could see that if this scales, goes up, eventually these companies are going to sell tools to our customers and they might displace us. So it took me about a year to get resources from this company. So I really wanted to do this as an internal startup. I knew that I had to kind of separate it, so we had a really old building that nobody wanted to be at. I took that building and I took my team down to San Diego, we acquired some company, and I took all the old partitions and old equipment so we would feel like a startup, so we would not be in the same area. And we decided to do it not on expensive workstations, but on Windows, because on PCs, because that's what these large customers were using. And it was very clear that PCs were going to increase in performance as well. And the CEO of the company was my only champion, because there was no internal innovation. We just bought companies all the time. But these are not companies that we could buy, because these are chip manufacturers. It's not our line of business. So he moved me to one division, and that division president kicked me out, figured out he can't do anything with me. I want resources, but I don't bring profits, because you need to build something. So he said, I don't want this guy, Ariel. So they moved me to another division. There's another division president. That one went away, that one went away. Eventually I was able to create a new division in the company, but there was a kind of a shakeout in the board of directors, and they took all the funding. They didn't even take the funding away. Actually, we had a new board member who was a very senior executive from IBM, and the CEO of Acer, a PC and personal computer company. He wanted to show his power, and he said, I'm taking over, and I'm going to do the negotiations with the leader in the market. We were already that far from this company, which is the leader, to actually adopt our tool and give up the tools, which was my goal. I did not want them to have tools. I wanted to commoditize what they're doing. And he came in, he was very aggressive, and he blew up the deal, and we ended up selling this to some small companies. And this happens again and again and again in big companies, because in big companies, you have to show profit. And you don't innovate in that way. I was a product manager for many products. I would always dismiss low-end customers. Who cares about the low-end customer? I have some tiny company in, I don't know, in Canada. Who cares about that company? What features they want? Because Toshiba pays us a lot of money, or Fujitsu pays us a lot of money. So these startups are always ignored by incumbents in the market. So that's one personal example. Let's look at another example, if we're able to. I think most of you know Netflix, right? And you remember Blockbuster? Anybody remembers Blockbuster? So Blockbuster at the peak had, I think, about more than 5,000 stores in the US. And their business was for, you were at home, you really wanted to see a movie, you came, you rented a VCR, and in the beginning it was video cassettes, and then they moved, when DVDs came through. And today I couldn't buy their stuff, it's that problem with my neck. You need to look at all the labels like that, and you'd find a movie, you'd rent it, you'd go home. So you had this, it was like an impulse buying, right? You really wanted to see a movie tonight, and your kids were already making popcorn at home and calling you up, where are you, why aren't you coming? Why aren't you coming? Because you couldn't find a movie, because you already saw most of the movies that they had on the shelves. So you buy something or rent something, and usually it's for 24, 48 hours, something like that. And Blockbuster made all of their profits from late fees. Because imagine you see the movie at 8 o'clock at night or 9 o'clock. 24 hours later, I don't feel like getting out of the house and driving to Blockbuster and returning, and the late fees, $1, $2 a day. So you pay up. That's a business model. That's how they made